Hey Hema.
Hi Ashima.
Hi, I am just trying to set up my. First of, tell me, you had joined this same link before?
Yes, I did. I
Oh.
gave me a recording in progress. I sent you a screenshot, no?
Yeah. ठीक है. मुझे लगा कि I'm just trying to set up my background. Just a second.
हाँ जी.
Video. Mirror my video. Okay. Hi.
So I can see the logo and I can see Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday.
ये I think ठीक है. मुझे उल्टा दिख रहा है, but to the attendees it will be fine.
Mirror ऐसा होगा ना?
Right.
Send you a shot so you know what it looks like. Okay, do you want to go ahead and try? Just practice out so that you're comfortable with the first few lines.
ठीक है. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ashifa from DFAN, Digital Futurist Angels Network. Hema, just one thing I want to know. Last time, any pointers from the last time you have for me?
Babes, I may not be able to remember like that. Then and there, मैं हमेशा बोल देती हूँ.
Okay. ठीक है.
But so at the end of this call, let's chat on that. ताकि आपको भी feedback immediate हो जाए, मेरा भी, then I can give and share. I won't remember 2 weeks later. Na? So many things are there, no?
Yeah. I see someone has joined us. Oh, that person left. I think it was a perspective.
Gurpreet Singh, Gurpreet to come, but I don't think he's Govind to come, but I don't think he's come yet.
Yeah. चलो मैं
गोविंद का नंबर आपने फोन किया क्या? You have his deck?
I don't have his deck. मैं उनसे एक बारी बात कर लेती हूँ. Just a second.
हाँ.
He's joining.
Great. You want to go ahead and give your first few lines?
Yeah.
Just make you more comfortable. So when you actually start, you'll be more comfy.
Okay. I would like to welcome you all to this webinar on free open source software. Today's session is third edition of the online webinar series Fridays with Founders, hosted by Digital Futurist Angels Network and Mighty Startup Hub. We started this initiative with the view of jointly adding value to the Indian startup ecosystem and creating a community of problem solvers through these knowledge sharing sessions. While most of you would already be familiar with DFAN and Mighty Startup Hub, but those of you who are not, let me briefly touch upon our working framework. DFAN is headquartered in Gurgaon. It is an early stage angel investment platform formed with the vision of helping, nurturing, and growing startups. Our thesis of investment is sector agnostic and is focused on deep tech enabled startups operating in the B2B and B2C segment. How was it?
Not bad, not bad. But you're not looking to your camera like you're looking and talking to a friend. You know, आप थोड़ा anxious हो. By the way, Govind will sign in any minute now. He's messaged.
Okay.
एक
ठीक
बार
है,
और.
हाँ, I get the anxiety कि शायद I'm going too fast or too slow, फिर इसलिए.
No, you're not going fast. That's good news. Okay. But it's not sounding natural.
Okay.
But you're sounding good. Do you want to talk about introducing Govind? So then let's hear that part.
I would now like to call upon Govindpreet Singh, who will be covering about free open software usage and its impact on commercial value of a product and marketability during M&As. Govind has been engrossed in FOSS compliance for over 12 years now, has first-hand dealt with multiple M&A transactions and global product launches. He specializes in software composition analysis and has also been a technical expert for legal teams in big ticket and high-profile global IP litigations. Works.
Excellent. Great pace, great pausing. Very good.
ठीक है. उसके बाद तो I'll be just be saying कि we are good to begin the session and
message introduce karana na?
Yeah. 2-3 lines. Yeah. Mighty Startup Hub is an institution set up with a mission to build conducive innovation and startup ecosystem by bringing together various technology innovation stakeholders and paving the way towards a stronger economy.
Sure. And when you finish introducing everyone, then say, so welcoming you to this Fridays with Founders, right? Where we are hoping that at the end of the session, you will be FOSS ka boss. ठीक है?
ठीक है.
All good, darling. All good. If you had the deck, you could have propped up. Otherwise, whenever he comes, let's try to get his screen up. ठीक है?
ठीक है.
Hi, good afternoon. We have an attendee, I think.
Hi, good afternoon. And I see Govind has also joined.
Yeah, but I think it's coming on audio. Kisle will be just starting our schedule in a few minutes in. Kindly bear with us.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Hi, Ashima, can you hear me?
Yes, you can be heard and seen. Good afternoon and welcome to the session.
Hello, thank you.
Govind, do you want to just try projecting your screen? Let's do a test of that just before we get joined by more people.
Absolutely. All right, is it visible?
Yes, it works. Could you just go full screen mode, please, Govind?
Absolutely.
Excellent.
Okay.
Ashima, can you see as well?
Yeah, visible to me.
Sure. I'll put myself back on mute so that the quality of the sound between the speakers and the moderator is clear.
No problem. Should I have my screen on or you want me to bring that on?
Yes, we can keep that on. No problem with that.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. We'll be beginning shortly. Thanks for joining. Hey, Narayan, I'll be starting in a minute, waiting for a couple of more people to join. We'll begin soon. Thank you.
Hello, I'm not able to hear anything.
Yes, hi. We are waiting for a couple of more people to join and starting in about a minute.
Ashima, maybe in the meantime, you can just give some background or maybe have some discussion with if anybody from MIT has joined, just to keep the audience engaged.
Sure. Let me begin. So, welcome everybody to today's session. My name is Ashima Sehgal from DFAN, Digital Futurist Angels Network. I would like to welcome you all today to today's session on free open source software. Today's session is the third edition of the online webinar series, Fridays with Founders, hosted by Digital Futurist Angels Network and Mighty Startup Hub. We started this initiative with the view of jointly adding value to the Indian startup ecosystem and creating a community of problem solvers through these knowledge sharing sessions. While most of you already know about DFAN and Mighty Startup Hub, but for those of you who are not, let me briefly touch upon our working framework. DFAN is headquartered in Gurgaon. It is an early stage angel investment platform formed with the vision of helping, nurturing, and growing startups. Our thesis of investment is we are sector agnostic and is focused on deep tech enabled B2B and B2B2C sector startups. Our investment ticket size is between USD 50K to 150K. And over last 18 months of operations, we have invested in 6 startups, evaluated more than 500 startups, and there are a couple of investments in more in pipeline. Our partner, Mighty Startup Hub, is an institution set up with a mission to build conducive innovation and startup ecosystem by bringing together various technology innovation stakeholders and paving the way towards a stronger economy. Having said that, I would like to now call upon Govindpreet Singh, We'll be covering about FOSS compliance, its usage, and its impact on commercial value of the product and marketability during M&As. Govind has been engrossed in FOSS compliance for about 12 years now, has firsthand dealt with multiple multi-million dollar M&A transactions, global product launches. He also specializes in software composition analysis and also has been a technical expert for legal teams in big ticket and high profile global IP litigations. So before we begin, I would like to add that we'll be taking questions at the end of the talk, and you may post questions either in the chat box or unmute yourselves and ask the questions directly from Govind. So over to you, Govind. Thanks for joining us. We can begin.
Thank you, Ashima. Welcome, everyone. I'd to give myself a little credibility that I do know about the subject, in addition to what Ashima identified. So I wrote my first piece of code when I was about 12 years old, I think. That's a long time ago, by the way. Since then, the journey in programming did not stop. I was recruited while I was still in my first year by Infosys in India as a consultant who would train the new recruits. I had a lot of experience doing freelance projects before I even graduated from my university. I did my first bachelor's in computers here in India. Then I moved on to do my computer programmer analyst diploma from Georgian College in Barrie in Canada. And then after that, I moved on to do a second bachelor's in computing science from Thompson University in Kamloops in BC in Canada. After I graduated from there, by then I had already done enough professional experience that I was hired by SAP as a legal compliance specialist. I did a few internships with them before I was hired full-time. And at that time, they looked at they looked at the interest I had in intellectual property side of things. So I was hired to deal with open source compliance within SAP. From SAP, I worked with them for about 7 years. And in this duration, we dealt with, as a team, with all the merger and acquisition that was happening at SAP. We dealt with dealing with internal compliance policies in regards to open source and third-party licensing. We dealt with being subject matter experts for corporate litigations, both in Europe and in North America. We dealt with a lot of high ticket transactions there. Then after that, I moved on to start my own business, which was technically not related to ID at all. But I picked up all the experience I had in merger and acquisition. I started my business. I think it was started with about $18,000 in capital as my own seed money. And within 1 year, that $18,000 was grown to about 10 million. And then this is about 2017. By 2019 December, we were doing about 150 million, all organically grown capital from the experience I had gained. So that is when I decided to take a little time off from business, and at the same time COVID had hit. So things brought me back to India, being with family, dealing with family's health. And while I was doing this, I started exploring venture capital, and I started investing in different portfolios. And because I had technology in my heart, so everything brought me back to giving back to the technology community. And I realized in India, there's a lot of gap in IP compliance. That is basically something I'm trying to fill in now, both as an investor from investment side, as well as giving guidance and mentorship to the startups on how they can prepare themselves for different rounds of funding, dealing with different venture capital funds, dealing with their actual valuation based on the IP they hold. And at the same time, I'm also acting on behalf of few venture capital funds, helping them do due diligence and identify the gaps that the startups have and how they can be bridged. So out of all of this, there's a lot of topics that can be touched on, but sticking to what we're here to discuss today, open source, which actually is really good that I'm seeing there's a lot of people that have joined this session. If it was back 2008, I think the only audience would have been maybe 2 to 3 people, because at that time there was not many people knew about the importance of the subject. But today I do see and realize that there's a lot of small little cluster of open source enthusiastic groups that are floating around in different metros. It's exciting to see, but again, there's a direction that needs to be given. As a caveat for this presentation, I am going to be touching on the heart of things. There's a lot of material available online that you can find out what kind of licenses are friendly, what are high risk, what is this, what is that. But a lot of that research does not touch on the core topics within the whole concept of license compliance with open source. I'm going to purely touch on those things. In the end, we'll have a Q&A round in which I will be a little hesitant to discuss very specific use cases if you guys have. I can always take that offline later on. I will be happy to entertain any generic questions that may be in regard to whatever we're going to go over in the slides. All right, so I will get started. So this is a typical architecture that we all have seen in our university education, in our deployments and work experiences. This is how a typical operating system is laid out. There's underlying hardware, there's kernel on top, and then there are all these different elements that go in. So within the operating system, as an example, there's system libraries, there's emulators. Nowadays, the same concept and architecture has gone into cloud. So when we are expanding the cloud, contracting the cloud based on requirements, it's all these different parameters that are expanded. So if you have a lot of database requests going in, all of a sudden the instances of databases are expanded. If there's a lot of hardware requests going in from, let's say you have a product that has a hardware element attached to it, then the hardware expansion happens. The third-party proprietary software is going back to the old times when we were shipped in a disk, a software from Microsoft, as an example, or any other vendor. They would say, okay, here's a software on the disk. You need to have these prerequisites on your computer. So that is when the user would install third-party or other proprietary software. So for example, a very typical example is the CPP plugin that always was required for essentially any Microsoft product that you were going to install, the CPP libs. So this same concept has not changed no matter where we go, whether we're on the cloud, we're off cloud. I want you guys to keep this in your mind when we go through the rest of the presentation. Let's touch on the core. When you are a startup, when you are starting to build a software, the essential benefiting factor out of that is that you want to make money. You want, if you come out to the investors, you say, okay, we have this fantastic idea. We want you to put your investment. The investor will look at you as a business, will look at the founders, will look at the idea, and sometimes they also look at the IP and they say, okay, we like you, we'll put our money with you. You guys say, all right, so here is our projection for next few months. This is what we're going to do over next few years. This is where we are, let's say, burning the cash now, but over next 3 or 5 years, we're going to make you cash flow positive. And you can make XYZ amount out of this. So when you are, as a startup, are claiming that, when you as a programmer or a developer or product owner are claiming that, do not miss on one thing, which is your code is the IP that you're developing. It is the code that you're writing, because at the end of the day, that's what's going to make money. So as a commercial product, you want to protect your source code. You want to protect the patents if you have them. If you have trademarks, you want to protect them. You want to charge for your product. You want to charge for the support that you're going to be providing for your product. But the disaster that open source can do is if it is used in the wrong way. So if this is your proprietary code and you embed open source and it happens to be copyleft, and if the embedding is done in a wrong manner, your full product can be forced to be open source. That is the worst disaster that can happen. Many times this thing gets unnoticed. Many times people don't realize what is going on. And again, it's not because it's intentional. Accidentally, we'll go over different ways open source gets borrowed into any product, different ways that it can be introduced into your code. If you have, let's say, a team of 20 or 30 or 50 developers programming for you, it may not be, you don't have clearly defined policies, any of those developers could be searching on the web for how do I do an X program? How do I write Y code? And as a result, they could copy something from the web, without realizing what is the license attached to it or where they're getting it from. So unless they know, or you as a product owner or a startup owner know where the different pieces of open source are coming from, really, you're putting a lot at risk. So when we talk about intellectual property, this is just a few elements that I'm going to touch for basics. Intellectual property is basically copyrights, and a copyright is an expression of an underlying idea. So a book, a software, anything that you can articulate in a form of an idea is basically a copyright. Patents are the inventions. Trademarks are your logos, the words, the slogans, anything. The trade secret is the confidential information. I'm not going to get into a lot of details around this because, again, there's a lot of material out there, but I want to help you understand if you have these different intellectual property pieces, how can you benefit from open source? How can you leverage open source? And how can you protect your copyrights, patents, trademarks, and trade secrets? So when we look at the third-party components or even your own product, this is a structure I've tried to put together. So trademarks essentially is on your source code, any algorithm or functionality, your code snippets, your components. With this is your own component. If you're building your library, your software is based on library, then it would refer to the components, and this can be your internal components, or it can be a borrowed component, a third-party component, commercial or open source. Then if you have, let's say, dependency on another operation of another software, this could be an example is a database. So if you are expecting the data to be stored in a database, that in itself is a separate software. All of this could be binary code, and then there could be ebooks. That is a content that either you're generating or you're consuming. Then articles, if you're putting them on your website, videos, if you are uploading them on, let's say, YouTube, images, if you're creating for your product as content. If you're into games, you could be generating videos and images or audio, or you could be sourcing them in. If you're contracting them out, your project out to, let's say, someone out of Middle East or Southeast Asia, Singapore as an example, a company that is making your audio files, your video files, your images, they are sending you different elements of copyrights. What you need to look at that time is, are they giving you sufficient rights? When you contract out that work to them, do you put them under obligation that if they borrow the image from somewhere, or if they find it from somewhere on the web, that they should declare it to you and also pass on the license that's coming with it? A lot of times things like this get missed, and that is what you need to be mindful of. So intellectual property, what do you want? Like, what is the reason? Why do you care about intellectual property? Out of all of these components, if you have an algorithm functionality, if you have code snippet, what do you want out of that? Basically, you want the right to reproduce. You want to make a copy of it in order to use that functionality. That is where the whole concept of reusability comes from. Why is the open source community looked at so positively today? Because of the element of reusability. Dependability is there. Then you want to take that, make a copy of that code, and then you may want to modify it. You want to adapt it, you want to improve it, or you want to adjust it as per your requirements. All of that entails modification. If not that, then maybe you like what, let's say, any of the open source components is doing. You see that, you were trying to build a product which can leverage the core functionality out of there, and you can improve it. So you want to essentially create a derivative work. You can even explore, open the open source component up, look at how different pieces are working together, and then you want to build your own implementation. You've still referred to that open source component. Then let's say if you want to purely rebrand it or embed it within your code such that your code works with it. Let's say you're doing a value add component around that. That is where a derivative piece comes, and that is what you want to write to. Then you want to then what the product that you've built as modification of open source or derivative work that you've built, you want to distribute that to your customer so that you can charge the customer. You want to give it to your testing team so that they can test it for you. You want to make money and revenue out of that. So you need a right to distribute. So these 4 rights are fundamental that you want, not just from open source, but any third party. So even if you are getting a code built from a contracted developer, you want them to assign all these rights to you, because at the end of the day, it's not as simple as asking a developer to develop something for you. You should always do a formal contract which says, all right, once you develop something, when you're developing it, you cannot just run away with my code. you will be giving the code back to me. You'll be giving me all the IP rights attached to that code. And when it comes to me, I have the full right and authority of doing whatever with that code. While you're developing it, if I don't like something that you're developing, I have the right to tell you to change that. So this is where exchange of license needs to happen. Now, what you can also do is you can tell the developer that you can never release my code as open source to anyone. Or if you are developing and you are going to be borrowing any open source components, when you give me the final product, along with that, you have to give me a list of things that are open source embedded in there so that I am aware of the liability I will have going forward, or the obligations I have going forward that I need to conform to from this third party that you have borrowed the code from. And it can be open source or commercial. Now, intellectual property license, I've touched on that topic now. So when you are asking someone to do something, or when you are receiving something, especially in IP's case, the license is a way to assign rights or to take rights. So by definition, license is a way or a way a copyright or patent holder can grant rights to someone, or you can receive rights from someone. So it can be limited to, or it can be as expanded as, what are you allowed to do? Are you permitted to build on that or distribute it commercially? Are you able to build on that and then build sell the final product? Or is it only a non-commercial use that you want to, or you want to permit? Then can you only use it internally to your organization, or are you free to do whatever? You can deploy it internally, you can test it internally, you have a final product, you can ship it out to any customer, you can charge them anything, you can charge for your support, you can charge for whatever you want to do. All of that is commercial use. Then is it an exclusive or a non-exclusive term? Are you only restricted to use that specific piece of code in a specific geographical area? So if something is intended only for India, are you only supposed to use that in India? Or if, let's say, tomorrow a developer out of Israel says, all right, I only want everyone benefiting out of Israel from this piece of code that I'm developing, he could attach a license that could basically put a restriction that this piece of code cannot be used by anyone outside of Israel. And nothing is stopping him from doing that. I can write anything. There are licenses out there that are open source licenses which say you have to do nothing but send me a postcard in mail stating where you are using this code. And along with that, I've seen a license where it said, just send me a postcard. Then there are other people that will say, okay, send me $2 worth of Amazon card. There are even fancier licenses which say, if you are using my piece of code, buy me a beer when you meet me. That is actually a true thing. Then perpetual or time limited duration. So do you have the right to use this piece of code for as long as you want, or up to a limited period of time from the time you've received it? Or anyone after you that's receiving it, they only can use it for a limited time. All of these issues and things are identified in a license, and you as a recipient want to receive the maximum rights. When you're giving them, you want to be selective when you give them. And in open source, depending on the license, there are different rights that you receive, which we will go over in next few slides. Now, license can have conditions on grant. So it can say, for example, if you are going to build a derivative work from this code, then you're obligated to release the final product as an open source. Or you can, if you make any change to this specific library, you have to release the code of this specific library as open source, but anything else you're building around it can go under your own proprietary or commercial license, or per se any other license. So this is license compliance. So license to license compliance is also a very important aspect of open source. Then there are contractual terms, warranties, indemnification, support, upgrade, maintenance. If you're going to, let's say, download a component from Apache, Apache is a very tightly knit community. They maintain their code very well. They have very high standards. They're considered as a community that has really high standards for coding, for maintenance, for everything else. But again, any of the open source components, they don't like to provide you with warranties or representations. They will never confirm and say, okay, our piece of code will work perfectly fine in every situation under the earth. Any piece of code is intended to work under specific circumstances. And again, commercially, there are different conditions that are given under warranties. Usually in a commercial license, you receive better warranties, better guarantees, better representations than in an open source license. Essentially, open source means if you are any of the high-risk licenses that we'll see, if you are receiving a copy of this code, you are responsible for its usage, maintenance. We or the party sending to you does not have any obligation. So there's multiple things like that. Then there's even adaptations of these licenses, multiple variations of these licenses that people like to borrow language from these licenses and come up with their own licenses. So doesn't mean that if you have a license, you need to look at it very carefully on what rights and obligations do you have. So software is protected by copyright. Binary code or source code that you are writing. So when you write your source code, it is copyrighted. When you package it along with other dependencies, make it into a binary code, again, that is the copyrighted final product. The functionality implemented within the source code. So for example, AES algorithm that you are implementing, the AES invention itself was patented, but then the implementation is something that is a copyright. A copyright owner has control over the work that he or she has created. You cannot literally just pick up a code from someone and say, hey, I'm taking this code from you, but I will not care to ask you about a license. It is always a good idea. If you are borrowing a code even from your coworker, ask them, can I use this? Can I use it where I want to use it? As simple as that. Infringement can happen knowingly or unknowingly. It can happen when especially you do not have permission from the author to do something and you end up doing that. There is a concept of copyright, and then there's also a concept of copyleft. I hope a lot of you guys by now have encountered this. If not, just to tell you the difference, copyright means you reserve the right. Copyleft means you have the right, but then everyone going forward has the right as well. So I cannot say that if I'm receiving this piece of code, I want to receive all the rights from you, but I will not pass it on to the next person. Open source community, especially GNU, makes it very, very imperative that anyone who's receiving a GNU license based software passes on the same license to the next recipient, passes on the same obligations to the next recipient. Copyright law enshrines, as per the language, the rights to the owner of the work to control all reproduction, modification, and use of the copyrighted material. So if I am a proprietary software owner, I can say, hey, end user, you're receiving this product. In exchange for that, I'm charging you money. I'm selling you a commercial product. Now, as a result, you do not have the right to reverse engineer my product. Typical thing that Apple products do. Typical thing that any closed source binary would do, that you are not permitted to reverse engineer that. Now, at the same time, what open source likes to do is it says, if we have the right to reverse engineer it, you recipient also have the right to reverse engineer it. That is the biggest difference. So they say they use the copyright to assign rights to the next person, and that's why it's called a copyleft. And copyleft is essentially the viral nature of open source. It says, if I have something open source, you also have something open source, and you have to declare all the modifications that you're doing going forward. Copyleft uses this law to enforce freedom. So basically what they're doing is they want to give everyone freedom to do whatever. This whole concept goes back to old Apple and Microsoft days. And I have a little one slide prepared for the background of all of this. But essentially, when Microsoft was generating all of these operating systems back in the time, there was a small group that wasn't happy that they could not modify things in there. They didn't have the freedom to do a lot of things. That is why they came up with this open source side of things. They said, okay, I'll build this something from scratch, but then I want everyone to be able to change it. I want everyone to be able to modify it. No one can charge money for just passing this on. Yes, there are permissions to charge. Even in a GNU license, there are permissions to charge for the act of physically shipping it. So if you're putting it on a CD, you're couriering it to someone, you can charge for the medium of shipment. So you can charge for the courier expense, but you cannot charge for the software. Microsoft, what they were doing was they were charging, let's say $1,000 for the operating system, and then they were charging another $50, $60 for the act of shipment. Linux at that time said, no, you can have it for free. But if we have to ship you the CD for Linux, we will charge you for the shipping charge. As simple as that. But again, there are other permissions you have or things that are unsaid. Can you provide support for Linux platform? How do you think that Red Hat was formed? How do you think a community that is open source, there are commercial implementations that get built, and then there are charges for providing you with care products around it. It is because of the unsaid around different things or specific parallel licenses. Again, that is another thing that has been done. If some under very specific cases from the original author, if you can go back and say, okay, you have released this piece of code under open source license and a very restrictive open source license, or a very viral open source license. Can I ask you, the author, to give me another version of your code under a different license, commercial license, or let's say any other license? And sometimes they may do that. It has happened. In commercial world, this is a very practical remedy to a lot of issues. So while copyright limits freedom, copyleft enforces it to all subsequent materials. So here's the background. The first time ever that copyleft appeared was actually in 1976. It was used by Dr. Lee Chan Wang. It was for a basic program. Now, what he did was he wrote a very small piece of text saying anyone who's receiving it is able to, for one, pass on it to anyone for free. Two, anyone can do anything with it. Anyone can modify it, or literally, if you want to change it, tweak it, build a derivative work on that, you have permission to do that. But you have to make sure you pass on the same right to the next one. This was the first time ever a copyleft kind of term appeared. And then Richard Stallman, he was behind the whole GNU initiative, the open source initiative, until 2016. So he took note of that idea and he used it to formulate the first version of GNU GPL license in 1988. So open source licenses, these are the high risk copyleft licenses. So open source licenses are in a few different categories, which we will go over in the next few slides. But I want to start with the riskiest ones. And why do I call them riskiest? Because you have very limited permissions from commercial perspective that you can do. But at the same time, like MPL and EPL, they are used commercially because they say, all right, so anything you do with our license covered code, that is open source. But around that, you can do whatever with your commercial product. You can embed this within your commercial product. So going back into the previous slide here. So this was the proprietary code. Now let's say the embedded open source was not copyleft, but let's say it's not GNU GPL, it is MPL or EPL. This whole thing still remains as the same green and red. It does not make the whole thing red, just because of the way these licenses are built, the EPL and MPL. But GPL is something that, like the previous slide states, if you use any code that is built on that is licensed with GPL license, you have an obligation to pass on everything built around that, even the derivative work, under the same open source license, and the next person will have the same rights. Now, again, it comes back to how have the different organizations managed to use some GPL licenses within their commercial, very large products. And these products are worth multi-million dollars. So how do they manage to use these GPL licenses? Well, again, it goes back to a gap that GPL or GNU themselves realized, which is these two licenses. They were a result of the gap. So back in the Linux world, when there were lib folders, the LGPL license showed up, which is basically now called lesser GPL license, but at the time it was a library GPL. So all the libraries within Linux operating system were licensed under LGPL license. But then the larger Linux platform was under a GPL license. Both of these licenses were compatible. The big difference was LGPL states you can use it, but if you're going to link with this piece of code, and if you're going to link with it too tightly, is when your whole product, commercial product or any other product or code, becomes open source. But if you link with it in a very distant manner, that is when you can still work with it and not have to declare your full source code as open source. So this was a gap that was realized. Then came cloud. In cloud, LGPL and GPL, everything was put there. Everything was being deployed within the organization. That is another thing. If all these viral natures of licenses get triggered when you are shipping it to someone. But if you're only keeping it internally, you don't have to declare the source code very well. So when cloud came along, it was realized that yes, so GPL, all of a sudden everyone started laughing that GPL doesn't apply. Well, GNU took note of that and they came up with a GPL license, which has the network restriction now. So MongoDB, as an example, is under a GPL. So if you're going to be connecting to a code or a binary that is under a GPL license, and that too via a network, then now your full product has to be declared, or code has to be declared as open source. So imagine yourself as a if you are a contractor that is implementing a framework for a company on a cloud. So you have two different entities you're dealing with. You're a middle guy. You're a contractor who's basically hired to deploy a framework on a cloud. Cloud doesn't belong to you. The framework doesn't belong to you, but you have to tie it together. While you're doing that, you are trying to figure out how to implement a specific thing. You quickly do a Google search and you find, oh, this is a piece of snippet of a script that can make this happen. You borrow that script, paste it into the whole thing. You tie one to one. What have you done? You didn't realize what license was that snippet under. You didn't realize anything around what was going on. You didn't review the terms and services of that website. All you did was a copy paste. Now, who's liable for if there was a GPL license attached to that script or a GPL license attached to that script? No one reviewed that. The two entities don't know what you've done, but you ended up putting it there. So now what happens in a scenario like that? So that is where subject matter experts come in and they evaluate. And that is where guys like me would come in and look at the situation and then come up with mitigation or remediation strategies around that. So GPL license, EPL license, MPL license, Eclipse public license, Mozilla public license, GNU public license, a Pharaoh GPL license, and lesser GPL license. All of these are very tightly knit, very restrictive licenses. Again, depends on what are you wanting to do. Now, Eclipse in itself is, just so you know, can you just put anything under EPL or MPL? Sure, nothing stops you from doing that. But what is the right way is MPL is used for very specific, they're a community of their own. EPL is a community of their own. So any code that is being absorbed there is done through proper standards, through proper procedure. So you are always welcome to contribute to these organizations, to these communities. You can always borrow, you can always put back, but all of that happens under the realms of Eclipse public license and the community itself. The contribution is very tightly knit. Same for Apache. It is a very tightly knit community. They have very specific standards on the code they absorb and the code that you're permitted to submit. Now, which open source license is best for you? What I've shown you is very restrictive licenses because, again, these are the ones that you should be worried about. These are the ones that you will encounter the most. This is what you should be looking at. All the permissive licenses or everything in between has a different story to it. Again, they will not restrict you on a lot of things, but these are the ones that will. So GPL, EPL, MPL, AGPL, and LGPL. These are the very specific licenses you need to be very careful with. Everything else can be dealt with very easily. So when you look at a license out of these, which is an open source license that is best for you, it really depends on your intention. So if you as a licensor or a developer, what do you want to do? Do you want to use the original license or the original code? Do you want to have a lot of restrictions, or do you want to do whatever with your product? How much of a liability do you want to take on? Because if you are receiving something as a code and you're building your commercial product around that, do you want to take on liability for anything wrong that someone might have injected into that open source code before you received it? One of the very big pitfalls that commercial products run into is when a developer, and this happens a lot in small teams, you're a team of 5 developers, not everyone is trained to find the right source for an open source component. So what do you do? For example, if you want to download any open source component, Node.js as an example, you can, literally there's Node.js you can go to, or you can download it from any XYZ different sources. So how do you know what is the right source that someone else has not mixed other stuff into and basically added or infested it with, cross-pollinated it with other license-based components or codes, and what you have is not the original Node.js? That is again a very specialized kind of a search that needs to be done. You need to get the right code from the right source. You cannot just do a Google search and whatever is the first result that comes to you, download the code from there. You can do it, but again, that is not the right way to do it. Because if you're downloading it from any XYZ website, you don't know what the XYZ website owner has uploaded there, or where did he get it from. Even though the package will look same, even though the checksum might look similar, even though the licenses may look fine, but there could be things in there that you don't know. So always, it is a best thing and best practice. As a team, make it a point that when you want to get an open source component, in your Scrum meeting or in your team discussions, identify the right source, and use one version that is downloaded from there. Another big element is, and this is again an element of cross-pollination, when you're using open source, unless you're getting it from the right source and from a community like Apache or EPL or MPL, there is a big element and unknown attached to open source components, which is the security. And recently, there have been a lot of incidents around that, where Heartbleed is an example, OpenSSL. Unless all these big corporations that were using OpenSSL, they were scrambling back in the time to try and find out what version of OpenSSL they were using, whether it was impacted, how bad it was. Because again, the same thing, if there was an organization that did not download OpenSSL from the right source, they had it from XYZ source, they would have a variant of OpenSSL. And that variant could have a different implementation of the packet exchange that was impacted at that time. So if everyone had it from the same source, vulnerability was detected, the original source would upgrade or put a patch on their website. Everyone can download from there. But again, when you have a team of, let's say, 20,000 developers in an organization, you do not know which developer got a component from where. So if an organization as big as 20,000 doesn't know, same thing applies to even 5 people organization. Not everyone knows where someone picked up the code from. So make it a policy. There should be an open source policy within every organization, no matter which stage of a startup you are in, no matter how big your team is, have policies defined. And again, I have one slide around that too. All of these are your open source mitigation strategies. You can use open source. It's great to use it. It's great reusability of functionality. It saves you a lot of time, but do it the right way. So which is the license that is best for open source? Again, going back to the intention, do you want to be able to share that open source? Are you only going to be using it internally? Are you going to be embedding it as a plugin to your IDE? Are you going to be making it as a part of your final package, build product? Will it get redistributed? All these different things. What do you intend to do with that? That is a very big question in choosing what license. Another thing I would like to add here is, many times what happens is, if you find the right source of a component, the original author sometimes, and there are multiple instances like that, where they give out these open source components under 2 different licenses. And that might make your position better, because if you have something that is under a high-risk license, there may be a parallel implementation available from the same source under a more friendly license, under a more permissive license. So you can always check into that as well. Then going back to the AGPL and LGPL concept of GPL, are you going to be accessing your code over a network, or how tightly knit your access to the library is going to be? Will that be permitted under the license? If it's a LGPL based component, how much of interaction does your product need to have with that piece of component? How far away it needs to be from your product? And again, by far away, I mean technically implemented. There are multiple scenarios around that as well that need to be dealt with. And these are technical use cases that need to be looked at. Now, these are different kind of open source licenses. Going from left all the way to the right is the worst ones, very restrictive. Left is basically very loose. So public domain, anything in public domain is public knowledge. Do you need a specific license or right? No, everyone shares that. Yes, there could be scenarios where it was unintentionally declared to public domain, but well, it's in public domain now. Then there are freewares, which basically state you can use my code as whatever. I don't care. I don't want any notification. Just don't bother me. If there is any changes you want to make, you make that. If you want to sell it, you do that. I don't want anything in return. Things like that. Free terms, where there's no obligation or no restriction. All of that is very permissive. That is what goes under the category of freeware or do whatever. Then there's shareware. Shareware is, yes, you're free to share it, but just don't reverse engineer it. Don't ask me for source code. Don't ask me to modify anything for you. I will do it at my will. I will never provide you with the source code, but the binary I'm giving you, you're free to distribute that, do whatever with it for commercial or non-commercial interest. There are licenses like that. So that falls under the shareware terms. Then copy left with linking exception, LGPL, as we've seen, that is a very specific license that falls under it. Now, can me as Govindpreet Singh refer to LGPL license and create my own license? Sure, I can. I can take out few snippets out of that, build my own Govindpreet Singh linking exception license. But again, is that the right way to do it? No, it isn't. Because what is the intention of doing that? If there is an open source license formally created by by thorough reviewers, then why would I create a parallel implementation of that? Then the copyleft license, very specifically, we've gone through the EPL, MPL, and GPL licenses. They're very restrictive and they're very, very viral in nature. If you receive something going forward, everything you're giving away or distributing, the moment you distribute something, the moment it goes out of your realm's physical domain, you are obligated to pass on the same rights. Copy left with network restriction is where AGPL falls. And so far, that and maybe one more license fall under this realm. The maybe part is I'm leaving that open because so far I haven't come across a license. And within the last few years that I've been away, if there's a new license implementation, which again is not publicly discussed right now, then of course that could fall here. Now, proprietary and commercial, this is where no company, as at least so far, wants to, unless of course they have intentions of making something open source, which a lot of Microsoft, Oracle, Google, SAP, all of these guys, they are pretty good at contributing back to the community. They are doing a lot of open source contributions back. But having said that, at the same time, commercial, these guys want to protect their IP. Anyone writing a code that wants to make money off it wants to protect it. So there is a lot of restrictions in there. Unknown is the worst one, and this doesn't get discussed as much, but as a professional coming from the field, I know if you have something that you don't know what license it's attached under, it doesn't mean you can by default assume there's a license attached to it. That is why it's an unknown. You cannot use something unless you know what rights you have. So it's best to send an email to the author, or how do you find out if where a piece of code came through? That is when you have to do a little research or get a professional to do that research for you. And the reason I say get a professional to is because if you leverage the right resource right now, going forward, when you make that money, you will not fall into a litigation. So money you make in future will not be lost to litigations if you do the right thing right now. On the left side are different parameters that we look at open source from, and this is what I've been discussing so far. So distribute source of it. Do you have an obligation to? These are different things we look at. Modifications. Do any of these licenses permit you to modify? Derivative work. Are you permitted to do that? Are you permitted to distribute the binary? Do you have an obligation to declare to the world that, hey, I'm using this license? Under this version of license, this is my version of that library that I'm using. That is called attribution. And yes, under most of these open source licenses, you do have an obligation to attribute. On a website, you can create a web page saying these are the open source components I'm using. But again, that can backfire, like how it happened in the Heartbleed case and even in the recent one in the US with the pipeline. The world knows what open source you're using, and as a result, you're opening a can of worms. So it's good and bad, both. Then there's the viral effect of the license, primarily for these three. For the unknown, there may be commercial literally wants to protect it. Then do you have to declare any of your changes? Yes, in most of the cases, if you're making a change, the license may ask you to declare it, specifically in the three viral licenses. Other parameters which may or may not you may be interested in to review is, do you get a patent license? What is your liability, or what is the liability of the author that is sending you, or a person that is sending you the component? What is the warranty you're receiving? Do you have a trademark license? Can you use their logo on your website and say, this is the open source technology we're implementing? Now, this is how do you look at different open source licenses? But as a commercial product, what are your interests there? So commercial use of open source, can you charge for the modifications you do? Can you charge for distributing that open source? Can you charge for providing support to your product, including for that open source? Can you charge to make source code available to someone? So for example, you've provided under GNU obligations, you provide the source code, but you provide the binary, but you say, okay, I will provide source code if someone approaches me. Is that something right to do? Or can you just upload it to a website and then say, okay, this is where I provide the source code, but how do you declare that? So there are questions like this that you need to have answers for. You need to be prepared to fulfill all the obligations, no matter what. Endpoints, I'm looking at my watch and we're 10 minutes from 5. So I'm going to jump through a few slides and we're basically getting close to end. But this is basically where the inbound points are from different sources that something can come in as an open source component without you knowing. So from your infrastructure, from any hardware, from any software, if you're receiving a physical shipment of a software, as a dependency, they can install something within your product and you may not know. Any researchers that you're leveraging, any testing and evaluation tool that you're leveraging or your team, they can have test scripts that may be left behind, which were not intended. You build your product, ship it accidentally with those test scripts that shouldn't have been there. Now, how do you deal with that situation? Then you may have contractors or employees that basically don't know something. They go on Google to search for it. And then as a result, they copy a snippet from somewhere and the license attached to that snippet is not reviewed. As a result, you have a disaster at hand. Content or data. So for example, you are receiving through an SDK data from a third party, and that data is covered under not Creative Commons, but something else that you don't know, or they haven't declared to you. How do you deal with that situation? If a third party you're receiving something from gets into a litigation over something, and you have received that as well, so how do you deal with that situation? Those are big unknowns that you need answers for. Then when you are passing it out along with your software as a co-innovation agreement with someone, through your SDK, you're passing out data, the content you're giving out, your reading material, any other data of different sorts that you are giving out, always attach a license that makes sense. Do not miss out on the license that you're receiving. If there is an obligation that you have to pass on the same license, make sure you do that. There are creative ways and different ways of doing that, doing it in making you do what you want to do. There are ways to do that, so just be mindful of that. Then I used an example of if I'm a consultant and if there's a cloud deployment I'm doing for a different framework for a third party, I accidentally inject something. That is a scenario that is presented here. So how do you deal with that? Textbook risk management strategy around open source. Basically discover potentially high risk systems with attractive functional profiles. Again, this is basically all the different points that a textbook states. I don't really think this is very practical. So this is what I propose, a practical risk management strategy. Ask these questions. What are you planning to bring into the code at the planning stage? Then what are you designing with? What is your prototype? Is there an automation tool for your UML diagrams? Is an automation tool going to transfer your UML diagram into a database structure, into your, let's say, HTML front end? If there is an automation tool, it may be injecting something in the background that you do not know, and you may end up distributing that. Then there's also a difference between client-side distribution and a server-side distribution. A JavaScript front end, if you're distributing that, versus a Node.js implementation at the back end, but then, is there distribution happening when you pass on the JavaScript to someone on a client side? Those are questions that need to be looked at. What are you developing with? So your IDE, your plugins for the IDE, your software dependencies, your network tools, all these other things. What are you managing with? So project management tools, version control tools, are they injecting something in your code that shouldn't be there? Any of the testing tools that you're using, ask that question to yourself, look inside. Are they putting in any piece of code that should not really be there? What are you building with? Your build tools. A lot of times build tools, when you're building your final binary, there are auto injections of different pieces of code from different open source tools. So you need to know and be aware on what is going in your final product. Open source license control. Basically, how can you do that even in a small team? Compliance with copyrights and patents. Maintaining derivative license types based on original software license. So be mindful of what you're receiving, be mindful of what you're giving away. Have awareness of effective dates. If it's a commercial contract, know when do you need to renew it, especially if you received an alternate license from the open source author and you're permitted as a commercial to do something. Just be mindful, don't lose those dates, because again, if you need to renew it in time. This is where I will end the session, and I will say I can open up for questions, please.
Thank you so much, Govind. That was really insightful. Taking out time today and share your insights with everybody. So, do you need me to read out the questions for you?
Hello.
Sure.
Yeah, sir. Hello, can I speak, sir? My name is K. Narayan Pai, sir. Yeah. So we had recently applied for a patent in the US for a new kind of a software. So I just wanted to know, I mean, before that, can you actually, since it's a very costly affair, are there any people who help them to actually decide whether it's really a patentable software or not?
So, sure, I'll give you a very quick answer. I'm not a patent lawyer myself, but I know how it functions. Typically in the US, you have a patent agent.
So voice is not audible. Hello.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the things is there's a concept of patent agents, just like how it is in India. We have patent lawyers that are registered as patent agents, but there are patent agents that are non-lawyers that can still do that evaluation for you. Their charges are typically what I've seen between $5,000 to $20,000, and a patent lawyer will charge you $25,000 to $30,000, which pretty much is in line from what I hear in India as well. So do you need a proper lawyer to do that investigation for you? Not really. Can you hire someone? Yes, you can. But again, you'll have to do research of who's the right person you can hire. If you're looking for a referral, you can always ping me later on and I can connect you with someone I know that does US patents and is only an agent, not a lawyer.
Okay.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions from Gaurav Gandhi. The very first is, how does one handle codes which doesn't come with license agreement on Git GIT?
That would be an organized slide where I identify the unknown licenses. So unknown license, go through the code, find out who's the author. If there are any snippets, any comments in the code, try to find that. If not, take snippets of the code out of that library, put that on Google, see where a lot of recommendation is coming from as the original author is. Contact that author, get a license. Don't assume you have a license just because it doesn't have a name to it. I hope that helps.
Yeah. Can I ask?
Please.
Yeah. So it was a great session, actually. It was really great.
Thank
First
you.
thing. Second thing was like there was a open source software that we were working on, right? So we modified it a bit. And now if we want to sell it, right, to some users, but as a service and not the entire code, right? So do we need to declare everything, like, or is that possible or not?
Depends on the license that's attached.
It's in the AGPL.
Okay, why don't you message me later on and I can help you with that. It is a very specific question I cannot handle.
Okay, great. But we can like modify and like, okay, depends on the license.
Correct.
Got it. Great. Even as a service, if we give it to users.
Yes.
Yeah.
Again, where it's AGPL, it's a very use case specific question. I'll have to ask you a lot of questions around your use case.
Okay, great. Okay, I got that. Okay, thank you.
Govind, another. Yes, Teja, please ask your question.
Yeah, hi Govind, really great.
Thank you.
We are developing a hardware product and
it's very hard to hear you.
we are putting it. Okay, then I'll yeah. Am I audible now? Am I better?
Better, let's try.
Yeah, so we are building a hardware product and we are using a couple of open source, IDEs to develop this hardware product. So in that case, if you are commercializing the product, what are the liabilities I'm looking at?
Do you know what license is attached to it? Open source license?
So these IDEs, a couple of them are having GNU license.
Sorry, it's still very hard to hear you.
Okay, Meher. Okay, Govind, probably I'll connect you offline.
No problem. But if I understand it correctly, you have a couple of open source licenses in your product and you want to commercialize your product. You want to know if there's any obligations, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so because it's a couple of open source licenses, a list of open source licenses is going to be required. But yes, please connect offline. I'll be happy to help.
Thanks.
Yeah, Govind, there's another question. What would be your suggestions for using AGPL for commercial work? What are the right strategies?
I've touched on a lot of them. Again, this is very the right strategy is if you can use an AGPL component without connecting to it through a network, that is the easiest way. Complicated answer is yes, you can still do things, but you have to do it the right way, and the right way cannot be discussed on a public platform. So what you do is reach out to me on WhatsApp on the number I've provided. Let's look at what use case you have. Let's get into detailing of how and what you're intending on doing, and then we can take it forward. Will that help?
Sure, thanks, Govind. Yeah, that helps.
Thank you.
So there is another question from Gaurav. If a code is written in JavaScript, comes with some license, is it legit to understand but rewrite all in C++ and have ownership without infringing the license?
Again, depends on the license. From a license compliance perspective, if you are recoding, again, this ties into the derivative discussion we had. So this will be a derivative work. If you have original code written in Japanese, you can rewriting that code into English language or in Chinese language, still a derivative work. If it is written in a different programming language as JavaScript, you're rewriting it in C++, derivative work. So depends what license is attached behind it. Depending on the license, you may have permission to it. So again, if you can reach out to me, we can discuss your use case and we can look at what permissions do you have as per your license.
Okay, and how can one handle code generation by applications like Kite, Tab9 or others, which are generating codes?
Yes, in this specific case, there's a lot of manual work involved where you have to, or per se, you have to generate a script where you should know specific pieces of code that you want to get rid of, which you know should not be in your final product or a binary. You'll have to extract them out. So either do a eyeballing through your different packages and take out whatever you can. If not, at the time of, again, this is where it all gets very complicated. So a linker and a compiler is very difficult and challenging thing to get into when it is working. But that is basically where you have to restrict it from putting that code in. You may need a binary modifier which can go into your binary file and extract all of that as well. So again, there are different ways to do it. Depends on how mission critical is this for you. It can be approached by tweaking your tool that is building, or it can be done by tweaking the binary that you've done it. But if you know something should not be shipped, don't ship it.
Govind, the question is a slightly bit deeper. There are tools now available and very recently, which are actually, an AI is generating the code for you. And they have trained that AI with hundreds and millions of code around internet. They don't bother about, I assume, about the license. They're not just training only on an open source one. So once you ask the tool to generate the code, it can automatically generate rows and rows, like hundreds of lines of code for you. And you do not know where this code is coming from. Now, who owns the license? And what if you get sued for that?
You just answered your own question because you don't know where the code came from. So first thing, that AI piece is incomplete. The AI piece should, when it's reaching out to expand its knowledge base, when it's building its graph of knowledge, it should also have a node attached to it, which is under what license and which source am I grabbing this piece of code from. So that, and this is where the whole concept of SBOM comes into picture. Now, after the recent whole oil pipeline issue with the US, it is mandated that any larger transactions that are happening at VC level for new startup acquisitions or a software product is being sold to the government of US, an SBOM of open source has to be attached, which identifies what is the open source you're using. And it gets to a point where governance, it's going in that direction where governance will be so strict that your binary, if you're giving it to a government entity, they're going to scan it for whatever pieces of open source are there. So if that AI is built, let's say by any XYZ author, they need to redo the work and add that node into their graph. It is very critical. The code needs to be aware and the end user needs to be aware what they're receiving and under what license are they getting that.
Got it. Thanks, Ashima, asking a question on my behalf. One more question.
So if granted,
I'm sorry, Gaurav was completing his question, I think. So can you?
One last question, Govind, and that is, like when we compile node packages, there are hundreds and thousands of packages that get compiled, and every package comes with its own license.
Yes.
Now, if you're going to look in each and every license every time, then I don't think we can ever develop, or the speed of development that we are seeing around the world will ever happen. So it's more of an open-ended. What is the most practical approach you suggest?
So Node.js in itself is a very unique topic. And again, where it's a platform built on libraries and the libraries expand all the time, there is a generic node license that covers the whole thing, but then each of these licenses have their own specific licenses too. Why don't we connect offline? Because it's not something I can address within the next couple of seconds. Let's connect. Sure. Let's have a, let's say, 30-minute conversation around this, and I'll be happy to answer your further questions.
Sure. Thanks, Ashima.
Thank you. Narani, you may unmute yourself and ask the question.
I'll separately, can I do it separately with you, sir? Evening?
My phone number is, yeah, I have WhatsApp on that as well. Feel free to shoot questions or email me or call me.
Okay.
Yeah, we have another question from Kisle Sinha. He asks, our startup is into accounting and allied services for e-commerce. We are planning to use and modify Adobe Magneto and the Django. What would be the pros and cons? Please suggest a strategy for that.
Okay, so again, this is a very use case specific question. The moment you mention Adobe, I would say let's look at whether they have an open source license attached to it or it is a commercial license. If it is a commercial license, then do you have rights under the commercial license to build around that, modify it, distribute it, or redistribute? And now you'll be a redistributor. You're not a distributor anymore. You're a redistributor of that. So do you have rights around that?
Excuse me. Hi, I'm Kisler. Can I frame my question once again?
Sure.
Yeah. We are planning to use and modify Adobe Magento, which has a OSL version 3 license, Odoo, which has a LGPL version 3 license, and Django, which has 3-clause BSD license. What would be the pros and cons of this strategy?
Okay. So OSL license is considered as a high-risk license, but it has permissions in there. So it falls in the category of EPL and MPL. So again, depending on what you want to do, you may have enough rights in there. Again, depends on your use case. LGPL, don't touch the library. Depends on how you're interacting with the library, how tightly knit you're going to be with the library. There may be issues, there may not be issues. Again, a use case that needs to be looked at. 3-clause BSD is very friendly. Don't worry about anything. It should not be an issue. I hope that helps. If you want to discuss your use case furthermore, reach out to me.
Sure, thanks.
No problem.
So now last question for the day. Rest of the questions we'll be taking offline. Last one is from Christy. When it comes to an algorithm, what sort of IP it will be? A patent or copyright, since there is no hardware associated?
Again, I gave a caveat in the beginning. I'm not a lawyer, but as a professional, as a person who's written algorithms, as a person who holds a patent himself, I can make a brief comment. So again, don't hold me to it. Contact a patent lawyer for the right answer. And hopefully, if there is a patent lawyer on the call, you're more than welcome to join in to answer this question. But again, it goes on the concept of, do you have here? I'll switch over to that slide actually very quickly. I know we're running out of time, but this will help. So patent is an invention. Copyright is an expression. Algorithm falls in between. Algorithm has always been a very challenging thing. When you go into the textbook definition of what is an algorithm is a mix of programming language and English language. It is not, algorithm is not something that can be, you have to implement it in a programming language because it's a description of how something is going to function. Right. So it can fall in both categories. If you publish a book where you are putting your algorithm in the book and advertising it, that is when it becomes a copyrightable thing. Now, if your algorithm has enough English language in that such that it's not implementing, that is when it can fall into the patent side. Again, depends on a lot of factors. When the patent in itself, when the lawyers evaluate it, they evaluate it on multiple different criteria. The patent office itself evaluates it on multiple different criteria. So again, contact a patent lawyer for that answer. I can only give you the sense of it, which is it can fall in between both, depending on is it a novel idea behind it? Is it a brand new invention that you're doing? Or is it just an expression of an already developed invention?
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Govind. Ideally, it's actually an extension. I wouldn't say it's an extension, but like an upgradation of the current, we are clubbing multiple algorithms, existing algorithm to create a much richer algorithm for our custom product. So that's how the scenario comes.
Yeah, that's the way you're describing it is already a derivative work of multiple different patents. So be careful in what you're doing. If you want help in how the derivative work can be worked with, again, reach out to me in person. We can discuss your use case. But you right now are falling in the copyright side of it. You may not fall in the patent side of it.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Govind. So we will connect with you sometime soon for the detailed discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. A special thanks to Govind for joining us today, and it has been a pleasure to have you here and answering all the questions.
Thank you, Ashima and DFAN and Meety, for this opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I hope we were able to answer all your questions. We'll be taking rest of the questions offline. And also we have another session scheduled on 10th of December. So please do join in for that as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.